We're here.
We
did
are.
it. Dropped in from the sky, and we have arrived.
Unfortunately, I landed on my head. What else?
Came out, and I landed on my head too. So
What else is new?
I mean, dropped on my head a couple times, and here we are.
You know what? It's not the first or the last time that we've shared these very common characteristics.
Yeah.
From head bumping to looking like each other.
But Tequila thinks we look like each other, so I'm in.
Shout out to her.
What a cashier. What a cashier. So by the time that our listeners and our viewers are getting this episode, Lyndon Johnson will be fighting the Vietnam War. We'll be talking about his legacy the next time you hear from us. But this episode's kind of a little break in the middle. We'll squeeze her in there, and we'll switcheroo on you. We're talking about Vietnam and the Civil Rights Movement. Now let's talk about the American Civil War for just a moment.
They're all related, right?
We have to talk about the Civil War every now and again because, as I think everybody here knows, we are sponsored by Civil War Trends.
That's true. And what a perfect time to remind everyone of that in case they'd forgotten.
Hey, segue that one in every now and then, right? Oh, bam, there it goes. Oh, look at this. Whoa, wow. Look at these graphics exploding across the screen. Yeah. So, I mean, we'll naturally get into what we're going to talk about here in a little while. But, you know, what have you been up to? You're finished school now, right? So
yes, this past Saturday, what was that?
That was
14th?
Yeah.
Sure. Was graduation. And, you know, I came to the realization at this graduation, this is so in first week of December, finished up my fourth year of teaching at Southeastern Louisiana University, which means the students that started in August of 2020, in theory, hypothetically, should have graduated this December, which is kind of neat, you know, that they've
getting old is what that really means.
I know. And that scares me because I'm really rapping on the door of 30 in like 3 months. And that scares me. But
okay, I'll bring up the rear. It's fine. I'm coming up behind.
It's I've heard this is that your 20s is a lot like a trial run. And 30s, in theory, you're supposed to have at least a little bit more figured out than you did in your 20s. So, I mean, I kind of learned some stuff.
I'm hopeful that that's true because if 20s is proving ground where it's supposed to hurt a lot and you're going to figure it out, man, I can't take much more.
Yeah, I do crunch a little bit more than I used to, which is scary.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I know that you're gearing up to come on back. The prodigal son returns.
The prodigal son. Big move, as you can see. I'm still in a room of nothing, recording on my little computer propped up on a bookshelf. But I had a great day out on the battlefield actually today.
Yes, tell me about that.
What people always do. You know, they always say, I wish I could spend the day on the battlefield. I just went ahead and just did it. Got in the car, hopped in the car with some friends, David Van Dyke and Jim Shapiro from Carter House, and we made our way down to Chickamauga, Chattanooga National Military Park in scenic, beautiful Fort Oglethorpe, Georgia, and got to spend the day chasing General John Bell Hood across the battlefield. Stopped in and saw our friend Lou Varnell at the History Company.
Big Lou.
What a guy. And, you know, you bring Lou something, and he always makes sure you leave with something.
Yeah.
So we've got General Roy Urquhart here now, ready to join the various 1/6 scale figures. I'm sorry, that Velcro probably sounded terrible, but you can see the Tom Selleck, Sean Connery in that face right there. That's Sean Connery all day long right there, pal. No, but General Roy Urquhart, I got another couple figures too. So, you know, it was a good day. We had barbecue in Chattanooga. I got to turn you on to something. The soul roll. I think I talked to you on the phone about this.
Yes.
Let's just put it out there for the listeners. Collard greens, pulled pork, barbecue sauce, cream cheese, mix it together, put it in a wonton wrapper, deep fry it.
Oh.
I mean, geez, good Lord. I can see our guest's face in the off camera. His eyes just got real wide.
I'm checking my pulse. Like,
let me call Wolford Brimley and see if this is on the permitted eats.
It is not. Wolford Brimley will lose a foot.
But so I was at Chickamauga, but I think let's talk tonight about really, I think what sets up the whole push eventually for for the United States Army's control of Tennessee and the push of the Confederate Army out of the state. And what that results in is, of course, the Battle of Chickamauga, but that all starts really back in December and January of 1862 going into 1863. So we've got Dan Masters, who's just written, Eric Jacobson and I were talking a couple days ago. Eric is my boss. Eric's also the author for Cause and for Country, which I think is it is the best episode, or the best episode, this is going to be the best episode.
That's right.
But it's the best book, the best treatment of the Tennessee campaign of 1864. Dan has done that with Hell by the Acre. He has done for Stones River what no one else has been able to do, which is to tell it in a very compelling, very dramatic, but also you can see the dedication to detail and the dedication to the research that Dan has. So without further ado, let's bring Dan on. And I think I have a little graphic and everything. Welcome.
All right, look at that.
Wow. That actually does look quite nice. It goes right there with the picture and everything. This is great. Welcome aboard to Homebrew History, Dan.
Oh, thank you very much. I'm honored to be here.
It's been a long time coming because, we've been talking about, at least Bo and I have been talking about, I got to get Dan Masters Civil War blog on our show at some point in time. He's got all these great articles that he cranks out. And then you go and you produce this. I mean, seriously, can I call that a masterpiece? Is it okay to call it a masterpiece?
That's fine.
Yeah, that's fine.
I do hope that there will be subsequent books later, but a lot of my life's invested in those 650 some pages. So it's just a delight to see it finally, see the light of day.
Yeah, I told Bo, I feel bad doing this right now. I'm only a third of the way through it, but it's every page has had me kind of like spellbound going on to the next chapter. And I don't mean this as flattery. I don't really do that well. I mean, it takes a lot for me to sit down and read a book about the Civil War, given that I do the Civil War all day long. Yeah. The last thing most of the time I want to do is sit down and read a book about the Civil War. This has just sucked me in hook, line, and sinker. So,
well, thank you. My work has touched you, and that thank you. Thank you. That makes the work worthwhile.
It's something, honestly, I tell my students a lot too, is my work is only as good as you receive it. If I'm sitting there, seemingly speaking a different language that's not English to you, and you're not grasping it at all, then what good is it?
History is very much like visiting a foreign country.
Yeah.
When you think about, the world of the Civil War soldier in the 1860s, even reenactors that, go out, on weekends and try to relive some of that life. It's really a stretch. It is really, societal mores have changed so much. Obviously our technology has changed so much. Our knowledge of the world in general. I mean, most Civil War soldiers were not terribly well schooled. And so their frame of references were, kind of limited to family and farm and things like that, and here we have, our 5-year-old kids have been exposed to all these different countries and cultures. So it is hard for them to almost like kind of shrink a little bit back into understanding what this period of time was really like for the participants. So.
Mm-hmm. So Dan, what gets you, because, we've talked about this naturally in the past, and I've followed you on Facebook and on the Western Theater blog for a long time. So I kind of know where you're going, but why Stones River? What gets you to Stones River?
Well, for me, initially the fascination began because we lost a family member there. Would have been my 4th grade uncle. He was on my mom's side. His name was James McLargan. He was private in Company C of the 21st Ohio. Was mortally wounded in the head on December 31st, 62, and died in Nashville a couple of weeks later. So my fascination with Stones River didn't start because I was fascinated with Stones River. I wanted to know about what happened to Uncle Jim. And as I started digging more and more into that story, you start studying, well, what happened with the 21st Ohio? Well, you got to kind of understand what happened with their brigade to understand what happened with them. And to understand what happened with the brigade, you got to understand the division. So pretty soon you're like looking at the entirety of the battle to see how this fits in.
Yep.
I think what fascinated me initially about the battle was it was essentially a draw. It was an extraordinarily bloody draw, but it was essentially a draw. I mean, both armies could argue that they won that battle, and I think they could make a decent case. I guess that split nature of it appealed to me. Fascination with Rosecrans pretty early on. I mean, I'm not going to lie, one of my favorite Civil War generals. So a bit of a I liked his command style. So it was kind of a snowballing thing. Once you start getting into this, you just want to learn more and more and more. And here you are 25 years later, and you've got 4 bankers boxes worth of paperwork, and most of the library around me is Western theater related, and it pulls you in. It pulled me in too, because I felt like these men had a story to tell that maybe really haven't been told yet. At least not through their words. And that's really what, with Hell by the Acre, what I aim to do is really kind of put their, the story of the men in the ranks out there on a silver platter so everybody could see it. I think so often commanding officers will give credit, all the credit to their enlisted men, but historians certainly haven't given them that, that same credence. Oftentimes, and I think it's in part because the story of the enlisted men, you kind of got to get into the weeds to tell it. And from a publishing standpoint, looking at previous works like Peter Cousins or Larry Daniel, you're limited to, let's say, 100 to 125,000 words, and the Stones River campaign stretched out over a fair amount of time, and to tell the whole story, you necessarily have to condense a lot, and where you end up condensing out is really the story, down in the ranks.
So that's I was going to say, and you just got right to it perfectly. I feel like that is the weakness of the other books, the Cousins book, the Daniel book, is that it feels like I'm just reading what Braxton Bragg and William Rosecrans and maybe William Hardee are doing throughout the day. And that's about it. It really feels very top level without ever getting me into the fighting. And again,
and I would offer that it was more a matter of, you only have so many words, and you got a fairly lengthy event to describe. That's and even as thick as the book is, that's like the 5th revision, and the first draft was 315,000 words. So we cut out 65,000 words out of the first draft.
Wow.
So I after Ted fell out of his chair, I told him I was done with the first draft. Well, I knew I had some cutting to do, but we ended up doing.
And you, of course, kept the first edition of the first draft with all 65,000 extra words.
Right.
Good.
Yeah, it was. I still have a copy of that in case, because there were things that as you go through and edit. There's soldier stories that are interesting or compelling. Sometimes they send the narrative off in a different direction, and those are the ones that were like, that'd be really nice to have, but hey, I got to get this down to 250,000 words. There's cuts have to be made, and that's just the nature of publishing. That you end up taking, really what you end up do is you end up rewriting most of the book to try to kind of squeeze your text down so that you're not spending 12 words to say what you can get out in 7. So there's a lot of that, but then you get to a point where you've done that, and it's like, okay, well, I still got 20,000 more to go. Okay, so the 4 paragraphs about John Hunt Morgan and Maddie Reddy's wedding, that's got to go.
Yeah,
it's like I ended up doing was leaning more towards removing, shall we say, preliminary content so that I could keep the battle content as much as possible. So that was kind of the compromise. But it's like I said, it's just the nature of the beast.
Yeah.
So Dan, Stones River is, a very unique, battle here. It's fairly bloody, like you say, and it's a stalemate. Do you think that because of the indecisive nature of Stone River's outcome, do you think that that's kind of steered people away from Stones River, and now it's kind of fallen into your lap that you've seen, that you want to shed light on this campaign because it is something that is arguably very unique.
Right, right. I think Stones River didn't quite get the this level of coverage maybe in the past. Let's be honest, it's in the Western Theater, and Civil War historiography up until relatively recently, I'll say within the last 30 to 40 years, was very heavily focused on the Eastern Theater. Western Theater engagements just didn't quite attract historians' attention for whatever reason. Stones River really, to me, when I think about it, it's part of a bloody continuum. It's not the beginning or end of anything. When you think about federal efforts to secure control of Tennessee, the beginning of that story really goes all the way back to Mill Springs in January of '62, and then you've got Shiloh, the federal occupation of Tennessee. The seesaw of the nature of war with the Kentucky campaign, and then the Federals coming back. So it's just, it never been considered like a decisive engagement. Something like Vicksburg or Gettysburg, or as a turning point of the war, or Chickamauga for that matter. I think I saw, it might have been Bruce Catton that wrote this, but the statement was written by a historian in the 1960s. And he said about Stones River, no battles ever cost more, meant less. And I think that was just kind of accepted as, yeah, this is just carnage. It really didn't mean much. And if it didn't mean much, it's not worthy of attention. I guess I would challenge that assertion. I think it meant a great deal, but I can understand, when you've got Fredericksburg on the one side and, Chancellorsville and whatnot on the other. I mean, what are you going to focus your attention on?
Yeah.
So,
yeah. And where do you squeeze the news from Stones River that, that it was indecisive, still hold the ground, have Fortress Rosecrans and all that, but don't pay attention to the casualty count. How do you slam that in there with everything else that's going on, particularly December of '62, which I think I would say this. I think it's probably the worst month of the war if you're in the Lincoln administration.
Well, and Stones River was the one victory in that period of time. And, Lincoln, as he tells Rosecrans later on, how grateful he was for Rosecrans and his army for delivering that victory. And in Lincoln's opinion, he thought the country could have scarcely lived over another defeat, because honestly, and they were very close. The Federal Army came very close to defeat at Stones River, not only on December 31st, but on January 2nd. That battle was won and lost by a hair's breadth. So
let's do just kind of broad brush, right? Because broad brush is 650 pages. Broad brush.
You're saying using a little finer paintbrush.
You go really, really broad brush. The Battle of Stones River in, say, 4 minutes. I'm going to give you an emerging Civil War challenge. Tell me about the Battle of Stones River in 4 minutes.
You sound like you're venting Gary Edelman there for a second.
I
don't quite have his enthusiasm. I'll do my best.
I was doing my Mikowski impression, actually.
Just walk us through. So the Battle of Stones River the primary actions were fought December 31st, 1862 through about January 3rd, 1863. The two armies that clashed were the Federal Army of the Cumberland, which at the time was known as the 14th Army Corps. Didn't become the Army of the Cumberland until after Stones River. And they fought against the Army of Tennessee. William S. Rosecrans led the Federal Army. Braxton Bragg led the Confederate Army. The armies came into close proximity near Murfreesboro, Tennessee, which is today essentially a bedroom community for Nashville. So it occurred in Middle Tennessee. Braxton Bragg was holding his position in Middle Tennessee. It was a great foraging ground. Lots of Confederate sympathies in that area. At the end of 1862, the Lincoln administration is pushing all of their generals basically to strike the Confederacy wherever they can. There's a lot of concern about British Parliament perhaps recognizing the Confederacy. So the idea was the Federal Army needs to demonstrate their superiority. It didn't work out too well. Fredericksburg, of course, was a pretty bloody defeat. Further west, Ulysses S. Grant's army launches a two-pronged invasion of Mississippi, both of which falter rather badly. William Tecumseh Sherman's thrust at Vicksburg, comes to naught at a place called Chickasaw Bayou. And that occurs essentially the same time as Stones River. I think the main battle there is about December 29th. The Federal Army moves out of Nashville on December 26th, about 44,000 strong, approaches Murfreesboro over 3 separate roads and then convene on Murfreesboro. There was some expectation that Bragg would sally out of Murfreesboro and perhaps engage them at Stewart's Creek. That didn't happen. Bragg gathered his army from across Middle Tennessee and kind of stood his ground at Murfreesboro. Rosecrans' army arrives starting the night of the 29th. The rest of the army gets in by the night of the 30th. Braxton Bragg sees the Federal Army coming in and sees an opportunity to maybe remove one of the corps, or one of the wings as they were called, and he launches a dawn assault on the Federal right, which was under Alexander McDowell McCook. Very vicious fighting south of what is today the Wilkinson Turnpike. For about 3 hours, McCook's corps fights. Johnson and Davis's divisions are driven off the field fairly quickly. Phil Sheridan's division, which is closer to the Federal center, fights a significant delaying action. But really, the story of Stones River for most of December 31st is the Federal line is continually being struck and bent back upon itself. Eventually, by early afternoon, most of the Federal Army is in position along the Nashville Pike. In some places, they've been driven back as far as 3 miles. But by this point, the Confederate Army has suffered such heavy casualties that their further efforts to kind of break this Federal line at the Nashville Pike really come to naught. A lot of fighting, repeated charges against a place called the Round Forest, which was essentially the linchpin of the federal defense. And the end of the day finds both armies having racked up enormous casualties. The Federal Army has taken it on the chin, but they've held their ground, and they still have an open road to Nashville. The following day, January 1st, the armies kind of snipe at one another. Braxton Bragg is surprised Rosecrans hasn't retreated, and for the rest of the engagement, he's seeking ways to persuade Mr. Rosecrans to leave the environs of Murfreesboro. On January 2nd, in the meantime, the Federals had crossed over the better part of a division across Stones River with the intentions of launching an offensive to take the town sometime around January 3rd or January 4th, by which point Rosecrans intended to have more ammunition and reinforcements brought up. Bragg's subordinates, John C. Breckinridge's division in particular, are a little laggard in finding that the Federals have crossed the river when that's discovered on January 2nd. It just so happens they happen to be occupying a ridge that Braxton Bragg identified as a perfect artillery location to drive Mr. Rosecrans away. Breckinridge's attack that afternoon occurs about 3:30. The intention is to take this ridge, which in the book we call Beatty's Ridge, because Colonel Sam Beatty's division occupied it during this stage of the battle. The Confederate assault actually succeeds. They do drive Beatty's men off that ridge. The problem was that they followed good military maxim. When your enemy's on a run, you keep after them. and they charged into a killing field where federal artillery took them under fire, and then they were counterattacked by Colonel John Miller and Colonel Timothy Stanley. And in about 45 minutes, Breckinridge attack was over. They lost about 1,800 casualties in roughly 45 minutes. And in the course of the night, Bragg was counseled by his senior generals that it was time to leave Murfreesboro. He disagreed with them initially, and then had a change of heart on the morning of Saturday, January 3rd. And the Confederate Army pulls out of Murfreesboro late on January 3rd into January 4th. The butcher's bill for the battle, I was working on the casualty reports here this week, totaled about 25,159 men. So it makes it the second bloodiest battle of the Western Theater.
Wow.
That might have been more than 4 minutes, but
it was a little bit, it was like 6, but
only 50%. I got to do a second draft.
I can't count
20,000 words. We'll be fine. No, what I think that helps is it helps us to kind of see the general flow naturally. And now we can kind of talk about some of the figures, some of the key guys involved. And, naturally you mentioned your sort of admiration for Rosecrans. Personally, I'm a big, I guess, Rosecrans apologist, I suppose. I feel like that's what you have to be. Like, you can't use the term fan. You can't do that. So I'm an apologist for it. And I feel like Rosecrans deserves a lot more credit than he's certainly been given in terms of the kind of the bigger scheme of things. And then the other guy,
his poor relations with Grant, really have harmed his. Frank Varney's book spells that out in great detail. And it's really unfortunate because I think I agree with you. Rosecrans does deserve a bit more credit for what he accomplished. Granted, he does have some limitations as a commander, which become more evident, especially in the Chickamauga campaign. But
he's also got incredible subordinates under him.
He does.
Phil Sheridan and George Thomas. I mean, you don't need much more than them.
Oh, and you're leaving out Thomas Wood. Thomas J. Wood. He had one to David Stanley. Yes, he had a very good supporting cast.
Look at the guys who end up in that picture of leaders of our victory, right? You've got Grant in the center, Sherman, and then way back at somewhere, you can kind of spy, Sheridan's right there in the front, but right off in the distance somewhere is George Thomas. So, you can see they make the picture. But no, I agree with you. Thomas John Wood is, very capable soldier. I have to think that because he's eventually 4th Corps, Army of the Cumberland, and that's all the guys I spend my time and
I remember reading once a soldier commented that Wood's bravery in battle was worth 20,000 men. That's saying something.
That does say something. But I take it right down one of his brigade commanders, and you know where I'm going immediately with that. George Wagner. What just a stud of a soldier. And naturally, I'm biased because, his picture.
Well, George Wagner he was one of the few Federal brigade commanders that had a really good day on December 31st.
Boy, did he. Except it started out a little bumpy having to fire a regimental officer right out of the gate.
Hey, you show up drunk, you're hitting the sticks, bud.
So drunk as to be unfit for duty. What a... That's the best description.
Unfortunately, he was not the only one. There was another. There was the colonel of the 69th Ohio had the same issue that morning. So
Harker has a good day. Hazen has
Hazen has a really good day. I would argue Harker's day was not so good. Harker had a rough time, but Hazen's brigade fought magnificently. Wagner's brigade spent most of the battle just under artillery fire, but when they had an opportunity to stage a counterattack, my God, did they stage a counterattack.
What I was searching for was this old draft, and I had to get it on my phone. I just, you're the guy. So here's the thought, right? This is graduate school Joseph here, okay? Just after 2 p.m., Confederate General Daniel W. Adams, Louisiana Brigade, emerged from the opposite tree line and advanced towards Wagner's position following the bend in the river. Barreling towards the Chattanooga railroad line with their flank hugging the pike. The 13th and 20th Louisiana clashed with two of Wagner's regiments. Wagner exclaiming, evidently determined to carry my position, I ordered them to fix bayonets. Their supply of ammunition having been exhausted in the barrage, Wagner's artillerymen had left his infantry without proper artillery support. In the lull of the fire, the Confederates pressed the attack.
I think Jerome Cox would disagree with that statement, but that's...
And then along comes the charge when the 57th Indiana and the 15th Indiana go in.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, they basically rip.
They rip Adams' brigade pretty badly. Yeah, they essentially, if we had a map, we could show it to you. But essentially, the two Indiana regiments charge against what would be the right flank. And I think it was the 16th and 25th Louisiana that was on the right flank. They got hit the hardest. The 13th, 20th got hammered pretty good too. But essentially, they got hit on the flank, and as the Indianas are charging, they're essentially getting into their rear. The Louisianans were already under extreme pressure as they were really trying to drive Hazen's brigade out of the round forest. They get hit in their flank, and they fell back. And I think, depending on which records you believe, the Indianans captured roughly 200 Confederates. They actually captured, their initial reports was they captured more Louisianans than there were Indianans on the field. And there was a number of them that, of course, were able to, a lot of chaos in an event like that. They were able to kind of scamper back to safety. But a fairly dramatic event, really the largest single capture of Confederates on the 31st. You didn't see that very often. The other major event, I think I wrote about it the other day on the Emergent Civil War blog, the miracle at the 3 Mile Marker. Where Luther Bradley states this counterattack nets a whole bunch of Confederate captures too. So there was a couple of events where that happened, but really most of December 31st was, the Federal Army taking a position, there being a hefty engagement, and then end up falling back. And that just kind of happened over and over. But it didn't happen at the Round Forest. It didn't happen with Wagner's brigade. They stood their ground through the whole battle.
So the sun sets on the 31st. There's a council of war. Am I wrong?
There is.
How's that go?
In the Federal Army. There's never seen anything about the Confederate Army having a council. It's
not Bragg style to have a council of war.
No. And honestly, by this point, there's a fair amount of distrust with Mr. Bragg, especially with Polk. Maybe not so much with Hardee, but definitely with Polk. But yes, Rosecrans holds a council of war that evening with his key subordinates, and there's divided counsel about what to do. I mean, clearly the day has not gone the way it was supposed to. The 31st was supposed to be the Federal Army crossing Stones River and driving Bragg away from Murfreesboro, and they've almost been driven off the field themselves. So there is counsel that, maybe it'd be wise for the Army to retreat to Nashville and call it a day. Other voices are, and it's depending on the different accounts you read, it's difficult for the historian to know really who advocated which course of action. I've seen accounts where McCook both counseled retreat and counseled staying. Which did he really do? McCook himself doesn't really say. But the fact of the matter is they have this council of war, and Rosecrans he needs to make this decision. And normally he would have counseled with Julius Garrichet, who was his chief of staff. Well, unfortunately, in the middle of the fighting that afternoon, Colonel Garrichet was decapitated riding at Rosecrans' side as they were going to superintend, probably about the time that Wagner's brigade gets involved heavily in this fight. And so his primary counselor is now deceased. I think it's significant that he does not ride to the rear of the army to basically scout ground with any of his infantry commanders. He takes the chief of the cavalry corps, David Stanley, who is a fellow Catholic convert. I think that is significant. I think Rosecrans, we'll call it a coming to Jesus moment, but he had a coming to Jesus moment, and he wanted another man of the faith beside him when he had that conversation with the big guy. And no one really knows what exactly happened, but they were gone for about an hour and a half to 2 hours. When they came back, Rosecrans was absolutely determined he was going to fight his ground out. He was going to fight the battle there, and he was going to, either win or be defeated. But whatever he saw convinced him retreat was not an option. Stanley's memoir discusses that they went on the ride, but he doesn't say at all what was discussed. So we're kind of left to speculate. Thinking all the dramatic moments of Stones River, which one would I want to be a fly on the wall for? I think I would have liked to ride beside those two. And really, what'd you all talk about? And it'd be amazing. You ride and find out they were just talking about how terrible the battle was, and they want to go home and see their wives. I mean, who knows? I mean, we think, we can't view these as like marble gods that just, spoke like, General Lee in the Gettysburg movie. They're normal, and they're not that old. When you think about it, like Rosecrans at the time, he was 43?
Yeah.
Stanley might have been about the same age, maybe a touch younger. So I mean, we're not, they're in the prime of life. I mean, they all have wives and families back home and other concerns, and they've got this heavy, weighty command responsibility upon them. So, who knows really what they discussed, but we do know what he decided was, he's not going to leave, and that's really what's significant.
So, Dan, two things. Of course, obviously, it's very important for any federal army to occupy that of Middle Tennessee, but especially after the heavy losses at Fredericksburg, how important is this victory at Stones River for the overall soldiers' feelings in the federal army?
Really, it's a question of morale. The federal army, even in the Army of the Cumberland, the news of Fredericksburg was a depressing blow for them. I mean, they're kind of doing their best to fight the war out in the West. They expect the army in the East to do the same. That said, the morale of the army was pretty good going into Stones River, and even with the heavy losses, morale did not collapse. Like you didn't see a big spike in desertion like you saw with the Army of the Potomac. Now, granted, they also didn't try to send them out on a mud march in late January. It's not to say there was no desertion. There certainly was, but it wasn't like you saw like a big spike, or at least not with this particular army that you saw with the others. I think the battle probably meant more to the northern home front, especially in the Midwest. The states of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, in some ways Kentucky and Wisconsin. That's primarily the Army of the Cumberland. So when they look at how the war's going, it's viewed through the prism of how's the war going with our boys.
Right.
Our boys are fighting in Tennessee, and if they're winning battles, then maybe things aren't quite so bad as maybe we perceive them when we just keep losing battle after battle back in Virginia and Maryland. So from that standpoint, I mean, when you look at the Union war effort probably reaches its nadir in that winter of 1863. I wonder, there was already question, whether we're going to be able to continue the war or not. What if Stones River would have been a defeat? Would that have been enough to break the camel's back? Really, it's very speculative. What changes would that have made? How effective would the Emancipation Proclamation been if it's coming into action on the heels of 3 significant defeats on the field? What does this do for English intervention? I mean, like I said, it just opens up a whole bunch of questions about the trajectory of the war for the next 2.5 years. But as it stands, I think it was it was a victory enough that it gave the Union that winter to recover. And they were different armies when they went out into the field again in the spring of '63. I mean, of course, Joe Hooker with his rebuilding of the Army of the Potomac, the morale of that army was much, much higher in May of 1863, prior to, of course, what happened at Chancellorsville, than it was after Fredericksburg. So I think that's that was kind of true. It was really, it was a very distressing, the last 6 months of 1862 were very distressing for the Union Army. If you look at the first 6 months of 1862, you would have thought the Confederacy was on its last legs.
Mm-hmm.
And they showed that they had a lot more leg left in them, with the Kentucky campaign, of course, Lee's victories at the 7 Days and then Second Bull Run, the Maryland campaign. So there's just, amazing how quickly those fortunes of war turned.
Mm-hmm. 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 Bo, hit me with that question that I was dreading. I'm just going to go ahead and throw the banner up there.
So, Dan, looking at Bragg, maybe not necessarily under a microscope, but he gets, and I guess all puns intended, I suppose, Bragg gets a lot of flack. Is it warranted?
Some of it. Some of it he brings upon himself because of his rather strict way of dealing with his subordinates. I think he's a very complicated individual to begin with. I don't think there was, you could argue there were a few soldiers more devoted to the cause than he was. He kept himself in the field when, by all intents and purposes, he should have been in a hospital. He had, chronic health issues. I think he had a good strategic sense of what the Confederacy needed to accomplish. He struggled with putting that into action, and he really struggled with getting his subordinates to put it into action. I think that was his key failing as a leader. He was never able to really build a team. Although I would also offer that Jefferson Davis never really gave him the permission, like he gave Robert E. Lee, to, shall we say, remove officers from command, especially senior officers from command, that were not performing up to Bragg's expectations. Mm-hmm. That's one of the Lee and Davis had an understanding, and I think Lee trusted Davis trusted Lee. That if Lee said, "Hey, General, Dan Harvey Hill is more trouble than he's worth," Davis took him at his word and reassigned him. Bragg, there's the ORs, especially the correspondence in the ORs for the Kentucky campaign, are just loaded with these letters from Bragg, mostly to the Secretary of War, but basically asking for permission. Hey, I'd like to remove this general, and promote these guys. And usually the answer is no. Yeah. So he's, I look at, the officers, and one of the key ones that Bragg identified right away that he'd like to get rid of is Polk.
Yeah.
Who is one of Davis's close friends. So you see how far that went. And, of course, and Bragg I guess it's, worked in management for a number of years, there's things you can say to your superiors you don't say to your team, or the things that, you kind of keep them shielded from some of that stuff. Bragg took a dislike to Polk, mainly Polk's, kind of sloppy command style. And I think Bragg picked up that, Polk's military training was about 40 years out of date and was pretty stale. And he saw him as a command liability. And he was pretty blunt about saying that. And he didn't mind saying it in front of a public audience. Of course, that gets back to Bishop Polk, and now it just goes from there, and these guys seemed like the next 18 months kind of at each other's throats, which is really unfortunate. But as much as you would think, if Lee was having these kind of problems with one of his subordinates, Davis would have forced him to keep him around. I don't think so. But Bragg didn't have that option. So, he's in parties. He's a bit handicapped as he goes through the war because, the command situation. And as I said, Bragg does not do himself a lot of favors. Bragg also really struggled, kind of not something that's talked about very much. He really struggled to develop a personal staff. He was perpetually short of staff officers. And he being such kind of a forbidding personality, I can understand why not many people were wanting to volunteer to work for this guy. So he goes through several different chiefs of staff. I mean, it's just, unfortunately, that the personality is, I think, what draws a lot of people's attention to him, because he's not a warm and fuzzy guy. He has some moments of tenderness, but they're pretty far and few between. Usually he's just kind of viewed as a taskmaster and pretty unforgiving. And he also has some pretty challenging subordinates too. So,
well, I just want to get your thoughts then, since we're talking about Bragg, we're talking about Rosecrans. I was just there today, right? I think the end of the line, because you say that Stones River isn't the end. I would say that Chattanooga is the end of this story ultimately, but every road takes us from Mill Springs to Nashville, and then a portion of that road goes to Shiloh. The other part of it goes to Triune and Murfreesboro, then down through Shelbyville, and then out down through the War Trace, down the Tullahoma Campaign. And then it culminates in September of '63 at Chickamauga. That victory rings hollow for Bragg, and then a month and a half later, fighting for survival in Chattanooga. And who comes out west but the guy himself, or who comes to take command, rather, the guy himself, Ulysses S. Grant. And that's all after what happens to Rosecrans.
Right.
So how come, and this is, I'm a casual Stones River observer. That's what I would call myself. I've read a couple books. I'm reading yours. I've watched a couple Jim Lewis's YouTube videos. I've seen some of the stuff you've done. I read your blogs, but I'm not as, say, deep in it as I could be. What happens to Rosecrans in between Stones River and Chickamauga that just kind of breaks him down?
The death of Garochet is an important component of that. Of course, after Garochet's death, Rosecrans does not have a chief of staff. He needs a good one. He's got a large army, and Rosecrans has some communication challenges. Well, we'll put it in manager speak. It's an opportunity for improvement. Rosecrans can be very excitable. Can sometimes say things very piercing and very wounding, but not necessarily meaning to, but it just, like you said, they just kind of come out. Garochet was the guy that smoothed over these things when that happened. When Garochet's gone, there's nobody left to do the smoothing.
Right.
And so the honeymoon phase that Rosecrans enjoys through Stones River with his senior subordinates starts to chafe a bit as we get into 1863. He generally gets along extraordinarily well with George Thomas. That's never an issue. He has an opportunity to remove Alexander McCook after Stones River and doesn't do it. Two reasons. Number one was McCook's family were politically prominent in Ohio, and that would have been a fight to remove him. But also to remove McCook would have meant that there was some truth to the story that McCook was surprised, and and the opening of the Battle of Stones River would be reflected unfavorably. So there was almost kind of like, well, we'll keep McCook around because he's such a good fellow.
Yeah, and you got to cover that up. Yeah.
And there was, I mean, sometimes you don't look a victory too closely in the mouth, because you see lots of things that didn't go the way that they should have. But likewise, like I said, there's multiple things there that, McCook was kept in command. Thomas L. Crittenden, his left wing commander, certainly didn't have the battlefield reverses that McCook had, but he typically did. He didn't seem to add a lot to the command equation. That kind of comes out later in Chickamauga, where I think at one point, I mean, he's not even serving as a corps commander anymore. Most of his units have been, kind of parsed out elsewhere. So you see a bit of, I don't know, call it that honeymoon phase ends. Rosecrans' relationship with the administration and particularly worsens through 1863. Let's be honest. I mean, after Stones River, the armies sat in Murfreesboro for the better part of 6 months. Some of that was recovering from Stones River. It was that cataclysmic an event. And some of it was Rosecrans' insistence on being fully prepared for this next big leap, which he was already envisioning going into Georgia. Mm-hmm. And there was a lot of logistical work and supplies and things. And really, the Army wasn't big enough, in Rosecrans' opinion, to do that until it had been reinforced. So there's lots of back and forth with Washington. Washington wants him to get on with the war. Mm-hmm. And those communications become more and more tense as time goes on. So Rosecrans' political support in Washington starts to erode, and then of course Mr. Charles Dana becomes attached, and that was a fatal. Ultimately would be the fatal thing that ruined Rosecrans' relation, or really his reputation with the War Department, and ultimately with Lincoln was these reports that Dana would send back. But there was a lot. Rosecrans is, some of this is things of his own doing. Like I said, he like Bragg could say, he could say some very piercing and cutting things that didn't settle well with others, and that kind of cropped out more as time passed. The whole thing about, once Garishay's gone, his chief of staff becomes James A. Garfield, a man who didn't want the job, but Rosecrans kind of, needed him, and Garfield accepted it. But, you get here in the summer of '63, even he's starting to send letters, questioning his commander back to the War Department, behind his back. So he's got his own chief of staff, I'll use a wrestling term, going into business for himself. And it doesn't bode well. Like I said, really, you see really the erosion of political support for Rosecrans, the key thing that changes after Stones River. He gets a pass for about 3 to 4 months, but after April, the administration's like, hey, Grant's driving on Vicksburg again. What are you doing? And Rosecrans like, well, I'm preparing. And they hear that's a buzzword for the administration. They hear preparing, they hear McClellan. Yep. They hear McClellan, and all of a sudden we got real problems. So
And then after Tullahoma's underway, and you've got Meade turning back Lee at Gettysburg, Grant takes Vicksburg, and what's Rosecrans doing?
Yeah, he only drives the Confederate Army out of Middle Tennessee for 500 casualties, but that's not significant.
Yeah, well, he sends
there wasn't enough blood spilled. And that was a lot of the Army felt that same way. They felt that their achievement was, shall we say, glossed over because it didn't cost enough bodies.
Yeah, that's one of the best responses from any general to the War Department through the entire war was Rosecrans says, my campaigns aren't written in letters of blood.
Right.
Also,
that's not an I can understand where he's coming from. The Confederate armies had these same problems. I'm thinking back after the Kentucky campaign. There was a lot of things said about Bragg in the press about how really a lot of disappointment about how that had turned out. And there was a Confederate officer, I think he wrote to one of the Atlanta newspapers, really kind of calling the newspapers to task. He's like, look at what we accomplished, getting into Kentucky with recruits and supplies and whatnot, and yet you praise Robert E. Lee for taking his army into Maryland and almost getting it destroyed. Mm-hmm. There's you see a lot of this kind of push and pull. The press has their favorites, and Braxton Bragg clearly wasn't one of them. And Rosecrans, I guess another, a little side. William Bickham had served on Rosecrans' staff during the Stones River campaign. He's a reporter for the Cincinnati Daily Commercial. Well, after the Stones River campaign's over, he goes back to Ohio. So now Rosecrans doesn't have a newspaper reporter on his staff to, shall we say, manage relations with the press. It doesn't help. I mean, these are all, you throw all these things out there. He kind of paints the picture, but by September of '63, Rosecrans is a bit embattled. And some of it's his own doing, and some of it's just, things that had occurred. And
so, Dan, I was going to say there is there is a section of the show that we do like to take part in, and Joey's already pulled it up.
Boohickey history.
Yes. So
I can only imagine where we're going with this.
Yes. So what Boohickey is something that is just absolutely garbage, something absolutely rubbish. It is something that is totally, inflated. It is something that is either not talked about at all, something that you find that you have to dispel, sort of a myth, if you will. And I'm sure, and as we've seemingly found throughout the history of this show that there is this sort of mythos to certain things. And it seems as you kind of delve deep into conflict, into particular battle, there's always some Boohickey somewhere. So when it comes to Stones River, what is it?
There's a couple of things we can talk about. The one I'll start off with this one. A lot of federal soldiers seem to think that the Confederates fought the way they did because they were intoxicated on gunpowder and whiskey. And you see this so many times. It's just did Confederate soldiers drink? Absolutely. I guarantee it. Did they mix it with gunpowder? Probably not.
Probably not.
I don't think that would enhance the whiskey. I mean, They don't get that much of it. You're not going to ruin it by sticking a bunch of gunpowder in it. But I've never tried it. I wouldn't know. That would be one instance.
Lucky for you.
I think one instance of Boohickey. Yeah. Confederate Army did not. They fought that well for reasons other than being intoxicated on gunpowder and whiskey. So,
okay, this is the most natural segue ever, Bo. You have to let me do it.
Come on.
Well, if you weren't going to have gunpowder and whiskey, what is in your cup?
Water. Straight water. All the time.
No gunpowder.
I got to maintain this trim figure somehow.
Hey,
I'm not trim at all, but someday I'm going to have a job as a Santa Claus. I'm just practicing for it.
It's about that time.
I got to grow the fuller beard.
Yeah,
it's coming.
If I could ever hit puberty in this,
if it comes in, it's all going to be white. So I'm like, all right, already got that going for me. I got the nice pillow belly, and kids will love me.
Well, how about you? What's in your cup?
It's whiskey, but it's no gunpowder. This is lovely screwball peanut butter whiskey. Fantastic. I'm going to hold off on the gunpowder. The thing is that Joey and I, funnily enough, I think the first time Joey and I ever met was probably on the Port Hudson battlefield, and both he and I were doing
Camp Moore.
Excuse me.
Louisiana.
Yeah, good old Louisiana.
Louisiana or Louisiana? Because I've heard it said both ways.
Louisiana.
Depends on how drunk I am. My vernacular starts to slur the more alcohol I consume. So if I was sober, Louisiana. But boy, look, if I get a few drinks in there, Louisiana, baby.
There we go.
If I'm at a Southeastern game, Louisiana.
Yeah.
Louisiana.
Yes.
Just drop the L altogether.
That's it. No L's in Louisiana. So, Joey, what you got?
I actually went through effort tonight to make this. So it starts with ice, Sprite, and then I found a lemon drop simple syrup cocktail mix the other day. I was like, I'm going to go ahead and just get some of that. And I mixed it with I think it's like Old Moonshine or whatever, but it's their blackberry moonshine flavor. Drop that in there. It's like a blackberry lemonade. It's not good for me, and I have work tomorrow, but it's my last week. What?
It's fine. You're just being historical. People drink and they showed up to work, and Braxton Bragg might have fired him from time to time.
Yeah. So
unless they were on his personal staff because he couldn't get anybody else, he would just tolerate it.
So before we end this whole thing, I just want the readers to see what they have to look forward to. Okay, just a little sneak peek, a little paragraph here. And hopefully you know where I'm going. 6 months after the carnage, Private Henry J. Warner of the 41st Ohio returned to the scene where so much blood had been spilt. The scene was still haunting. When at leisure I wandered over the field, shells of various descriptions lay scattered harmlessly about here and there. A pile of rails marked the abode of death. I could not stay the trembling tear when so forcibly reminded of my departed comrade Joel Strong, who shared with me our blankets and pillow, and who breathed his last amidst the roar of battle. Tell my friends I died for my country and trusting in God. I hope to never again be called to witness such soul-sickening scenes as I was obliged to view at night upon that awful field. There you go. And I know that's mostly a quote, but my goodness gracious alive, I mean, that you go through and you find all these wonderful sort of firsthand accounts, these wonderful primary sources to work in here, and you really let the soldiers tell the story. This is the way it needs to be done. It needs to be done through the ground level, and what a masterful, just no pun intended, Dan Masters' masterful masterpiece on the Battle of Stones River.
You're making me turn red, and the cameras can see it. So,
well, there we go. Dan, thanks for joining. Bo, we have a whole other episode to do after this because we're just gluttons for punishment. But
we're switching from American Civil War to civil rights and Lyndon Johnson. So we'll get there.
Nice little break in between. Dan, thanks for joining us. Bo, I'll see you in just a couple minutes. To everybody else out there that's watching or listening from at home, remember that Homebrew History is brought to you by Civil War Trails. Get out there and make some history of your own. I don't know the voice I'm doing. It felt right. It
sounded right.
Yeah. All right, Bo, catch you next time. Dan, cheers. Thanks again.
Thanks, Dan.
Thank you very much. Enjoyed being here.
Oh.